So this week's Parsha is Parshas Behar. It begins on page 697 in the Art Scroll Stone Chumash. And it begins in chapter 25, verse 1 in Vayikra. Hashem spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall observe a Sabbath rest for Hashem." This is the Shemitah year, the mitzvah of the sabbatical year. And then it gives details then. Some of the mitzvahs of this sabbatical year. For 6 years you may sow your crop, your field. In 6 years you may prune your vineyard, and you may gather in the crop. And on the 7th year shall be a complete rest for the land, a Shabbos for Hashem. Your field you shall not sow, your vineyard you shall not prune. The aftergrowth of your harvest you shall not reap. The grapes you have set aside for yourself you shall not pick. It is a year of rest for the land. The Shabbos produce of the land shall be yours to eat, for you, your slave, your maidservant, your laborer, for your resident who dwells with you, and for your animal, for the beast that is in your land, shall all its crop be to eat. So we have a more detailed version of the laws of Shemitah. So in the commentaries Rashi comments on how the introduction to this mitzvah, that it says Hashem spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai, saying that Mount Sinai has been a while ago, and we've left Mount Sinai already and been traveling through the desert. So why is it specified that Hashem spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai? So the commentaries say, and Rashi brings, the Medrash says, that just like the mitzvah, that the Torah is trying to say that just like the mitzvah of Shemitah, of the sabbatical year, was taught to Moshe at Mount Sinai, so every mitzvah was taught to Moshe on Mount Sinai. And the Ramban explains a little more in depth, is that we already had these mitzvahs of Shemitah, of the sabbatical year already. I think it was in Parshas Mishpatim. Parsha. Okay, it's going to take me a little too long, I think, to find it. But we already had the mitzvah of Shemitah earlier, mentioned at Mount Sinai, but it was given in a very short form. Basically, that you have the sabbatical year that you can't work the land. And here it goes into more detail. And that's the point that the Medrash is making. I found it on page 435 for those who are interested. It says in verse 10, the 6 years you shall sow your land and gather its produce. The 7th you shall leave it untended and unharvested, and the destitute of your people shall eat. And that's pretty much the extent of what it says about the Shemitah year. And here it goes into more detail. And the Ramban says that's the point that the Medrash is making, is that one may think that we had the basic mitzvahs were given to Moshe on Mount Sinai, and everything more than that, any more elaboration, were stuff that Moshe figured out on his own. And that's the point that Torah is saying, that just like even though earlier it mentioned just the basic mitzvah, and here it elaborates further and gives more details. So it's saying that the details were also taught to Moshe at Mount Sinai, not just the table of contents, not just the basic idea of the mitzvah, but all of the details and all the specifics of the mitzvah were also taught to Moshe on Mount Sinai. And just like by Shemitah, that was the case. It's true by every mitzvah.
Now, would this be because, in more detail here, because it took Moshe until now to tell everybody else?
So that's a separate question of why is it here over other places? And the commentaries deal with this, is that the Ramban actually deals with that. And he says that the entire time until now, we were trying to get to this. That it gave the mitzvah of Shemitah, but then it went into more detail into the special covenant that we had with the giving of the second tablets. And once we did that, we taught about the building of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, because that was the building of the Mishkan. The building of the tabernacle was a re-emphasis of that Hashem's presence lives amongst us even after we had sinned with the sin of the golden calf. And once we talked about the tabernacle, we talked about the offerings we brought and the laws of the Levium, and now we're finally getting back to that. But the point is that the details also were given at Mount Sinai, not just the basics. And now Moshe is teaching them to us. Okay, so what are these laws of Shemitah? So, which I believe is this year is Shemitah as well. This year is Shemitah. So, oh yes. So when I came here, I think on a Shemitah year. And yes, I think my first year here was a Shemitah year. And again, it's a Shemitah year because we arranged the Prusbul, which I'll talk about. So,
Not with me ever since.
yeah. So the Shemitah year, as we were saying, you're not allowed to, they're not allowed to work the field. That means pretty much you have to leave the land fallow. You're allowed to do some basic things. This is only in the land of Israel. And you're allowed to do some basic things just to keep the stuff alive. So like, I believe you could water, like you have trees, you could water the trees just enough that they won't die, but you can't water them to make healthy fruits because that's working the land to get the fruits. So what about the stuff that grows? Meaning sometimes even when you don't plant, things will grow in the field. So those you're allowed to eat, and anyone's allowed to eat. The mitzvah is to allow anybody to come in and eat from your field. But at a certain point, once there's nothing left out for the animals, even what you took into your own house, you have to bring out. So like you could take, you could bring, let's say you have an apple orchard. So you could take apples into your house to eat, but once the apples are gone, you have to bring the stuff that are in your house out also. And anybody also is allowed to come into your orchard and eat the apples. Okay. Another, what's that?
Feed the apple.
Yeah, you can do that too.
It'll.
Yeah, I've seen it. I've done it. But another mitzvah of Shemitah though is that on Shemitah, any loan that a person lent to another Jew, he can't collect it after Shemitah and after the sabbatical year. And there became a problem. There's a special mitzvah in the Torah not to refrain from lending because of the Shemitah year, but unfortunately, there was a time that people were refraining from lending around the Shemitah year. They were seeing that the Shemitah year is coming, and they wouldn't lend the money because they were afraid they wouldn't get it back. So the Hillel, the great sage, enacted a loophole for being able to collect the loan, and that is that an individual cannot collect their loan from the Shemitah. But if they give their loans over to a Jewish court, so then they could collect the loans for technical reasons. So, so the custom Hillel enacted that people would make a contract. They would write a document that certifies that they're giving their loan over to the court to collect, and then they could collect it after the Shemitah year. And that's something probably the Kollel will take care of for people, just drawing up this and being the court to allow people to collect their loans. Okay, where are we? Okay, so next, thank you. We're on 697 verse 8. Next is the Yovel, the Jubilee year. So after, you shall count for yourself 7 cycles of sabbatical years, 7 years, 7 times. The years of the 7 cycles of the sabbatical year should be for you 49 years. So that's 7 sabbatical year cycles, which should look familiar because very similar to the 7 weeks of the Sphira, of the counting of the Omer, which is also 7 day periods. It's 7 day periods in the 50th day of Shavuos. In this case, you have 7 week periods. 7 year. You have a 7 year cycle. You have 7 of these 7 year cycles. The 50th year is the 50th year is the Jubilee year, and on the Jubilee year, it says you shall sound the shofar throughout your land on page 699, and that 50th year is sanctified, and all the slaves, thank you, all the slaves go free in that 50th year, and these are the Jewish slaves. All the Jewish bondsmen would go free, and additionally, all land that anybody sold in the land of Israel would go back to their original owner, with some small exceptions, which we'll see. And as it says in verse 14 on page 699, when you make a sale to your fellow or make a purchase from the hand of your fellow, do not aggrieve one another. According to the number of years after the Jubilee year shall you buy from your fellow. According to the number of crop years he shall sell to you. That means, so first of all, there's a mitzvah there that that do not aggrieve one another. What does that mean? That when you sell something, do not rip anybody off. Or when you buy something, don't rip anybody off. And that means that you should not overcharge somebody for something you're selling. And there's a prohibition in the Torah to overcharge, and there's a prohibition in the Torah to underpay. So if there's a stable price for something, there's a stable market price, it's prohibited by the Torah to sell to your fellow at either to sell it at an elevated price, or price gouging, to sell it at an elevated price, or for somebody to underpay. Now, if they come to an agreement that I understand that this is the price, but I want to sell it to you at a discount, so that's allowed. But to rip the guy off and to either trick him or to take advantage of somebody to sell it at either a higher price or a lower price, that's prohibited. And because of this, like we mentioned, that every Jubilee year, the 50th year, the land goes back to the original owner. And the original owner is, and who's the original owner? The original owner is that when the Jews came into the land of Israel, so the land was split up amongst the tribes. Each tribe got a portion, and within the tribe, each family got a portion. And through inheritance, those portions were broken down, and whoever was the inheritor of that land from that dividing up from the days of Yeshua, the days of Joshua, when they divided up after the conquest of the land, that is the owner that it goes back to on the Shemitah year, which is an incredible thing, because this way, first of all, each tribe, the land was given to the tribes because of the personality and the spiritual nature of each of the tribes. And each tribe, the tribes aren't just families, sons of Yaakov, but each one had their own unique spiritual nature and spiritual mission. And the land that they were given was suitable for that. So each tribe retained their land. And the only way it left the tribe was, was if someone didn't have any sons and they had a daughter inherit and she would marry someone from another tribe. So then it would actually leave the tribe. But and then their sons, who may be from another tribe, would inherit it. But for the most part, the land stayed within the tribe, and it stayed within families. So families would live together, which is a beautiful thing, because the family plot of land, it was broken up each generation by the inheritors, and they would own that land for in perpetuity, really, because even if they would sell it, it would come back to them in the Jubilee year, so the family would be reunited in their location.
When did we lose track of it?
Well, once
Exile.
when the Jews weren't living in the land of Israel, even when some of them weren't. So when the 10 tribes were exiled, so at that point, the Jubilee year was not in effect anymore. And the Medrash, the Gemara actually said that they were returned. That one of the prophets, I think, Yirmiyahu, the prophet Jeremiah, actually tracked them down and brought them back. But once we were exiled again, so then the main Jewish community did not live in the land of Israel anymore, and then the Jubilee year was not in effect anymore. And so anyway, so this was very relevant, because the price of the land would depend on how long you'd be living, how long you'd own it, because no sale was really a sale; it was really a long-term lease. It's really a long-term lease. So, and that's what the Torah is saying here, that do not aggrieve one another. According to the number of years after the Jubilee year shall you buy from your fellow. According to the number of crop years, you shall sell it to you. That if you have to calculate, if it's 10 years to the Shemitah year, you have to take that to the Yovel, to the Jubilee year, you have to take that into account when you're buying it, because it's not really an eternal sale, it's a 10-year lease. So you have to take that into account when you sell it, or else you will be overcharging the person. Okay, and in verse 17, each of you shall not aggrieve his fellow, and you shall fear your God, for I am Hashem your God. So we already said earlier in verse 14, when you make a sale or a purchase, do not aggrieve one another. Now the Torah repeats, do not aggrieve one another, and I say to say that this one is not in reference to aggrieving someone with a purchase. This is aggrieving somebody else with words, and that is speaking to somebody in a way that causes them pain. and that whether it's coming up with a nickname for somebody that disturbs them, or reminding them of.
Notorious for
Okay,
that.
well, now we know to be mindful, and whether it's giving someone a nickname that causes them pain, or reminding someone of incidents in their past that might be disturbing. So that is prohibited by the Torah with this verse. Okay, and it continues in verse 18. You shall perform my decrees, observe my ordinances, and perform them. Then you shall dwell securely on your land. But which implies that if we do not perform these mitzvahs, we will not dwell securely in the land. And Rashi says, in fact, that we were the first exile from the land was for 70 years, and that was we were exiled by Babylonians, by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. And we went through they were conquered by the Persians and the Medes, and we were let back into the land of Israel to rebuild the temple. We built the second temple 70 years later. And those 70 years, Rashi goes through a whole calculation about how many Shemitahs and Yovels there were that we did not observe when we were out of sorts in our observance of the mitzvahs. And he comes up that there were actually 70 Shemitahs and Yovels. He has, because it's easy to calculate, because in every 50 years there will be 7 Shemitahs and 1 Yovel. So 100 years you have 16. You have 16. You have 16 every 100 years, and he comes up with the number 70. Interesting. And so there were 70 Shemitahs and Yovels that we didn't observe, and because of that, we were out. And the Shemitah, what is the Shemitah year? It's a year that we leave the land fallow. We don't work the land, and it's a reminder and it's a demonstration of our belief that what we have, it isn't coming from our own hands, it's coming from Hashem. That we put in the work and we do our hishtadlus, we do our effort, but what our results are, any result is by virtue of Hashem giving us that result. And if somebody doesn't, and when we don't do that, we're demonstrating that's not our belief. First of all, well, I'll go there later, but so then Hashem takes us out of the land, so we're once again not working our land because we're removed from our land. And additionally, they say that's a continuation to this section about overcharging and underpaying. Why is someone ripping someone off? It's because they need the money. They want that money. And if we believe that the result comes from Hashem, so we wouldn't be looking for illicit means to profit, because our profit, whatever we end up with, comes from Hashem. So we don't need to be looking for to profit at the expense of somebody else. Okay, so then there's the laws of redemption of the land. In verse 23, we said on page 701, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, for you are sojourners and residents with me. The land is God's, it's not ours. And we were given the land by Hashem, but only because Hashem wills us to have it. In the entire land of your ancestral heritage, you shall provide redemption for the land. If your brother becomes impoverished and sells part of his ancestral heritage, his redeemer who is closest to him shall come and redeem his brother's sale. So if a person sells their land, if the person sells, let's say, their field, so a relative could redeem it, and the buyer is obligated. This is besides going back in the Yovel in the Jubilee year. The buyer is required to sell it back to a relative of the seller. If a man will have no redeemer, but his means suffice, if a person makes some money and is able to buy it back, he could buy it back. Then he shall reckon the years of the sale and return the remainder to the man whom he has sold it. And once again, it all depends on the lease. It's really a lease more than a sale, because the buyer would only have it for a certain amount of time anyway. Okay, and that's in a field. And our sages say that you're only allowed to do this after 2 years. That the buyer is able to enjoy the fruits of his purchase, and he has 2 years that he's allowed to use his field. And after those 2 years, it's not, he could use it until the Yovel, until the Jubilee year, but the family of the seller is not able to force him to sell it back for 2 years of harvest. Okay. And if there's a year where there's no harvest, let's say one of those years is a Shemitah year, is a year of rest, or it was a year of famine or whatever it is, and there was nothing they were able to get out of their land, so then that would not count towards the 2 years. Okay, then there's if a person sells a residence house in a walled city, its redemption can take place until the end of the year of its sale. So you only have one. So if a person sells a house in a walled city, which is considered a more permanent dwelling, so then he's allowed to redeem it for the year of the sale. But if it passed by a year, then the home that is in the city that has a wall shall pass in perpetuity to the one who purchased it for his generations, shall not go out in the Jubilee year. So this is an exception to all property going back in the 50th Jubilee year, and that is a house in a walled city. And this is a city that was walled from the days of Yeshua, our sages explain. So in such a city, if someone sold a house and does not buy it back within that first year, so it's sold into perpetuity. Okay, and now in verse 32, there's another, page 703. As for the cities of the Levites, and there were 48 cities in the land of Israel that were given to the Leviim, they did not have any contiguous portion in the land like the other tribes. Instead, they had cities scattered throughout the land, 48 cities. So the homes in the cities, their ancestral heritage, the Levites shall have an eternal right of redemption. And what one will buy from a Levite, a home that has been sold or a city of an ancestral heritage, shall go out in the Jubilee year. So by the Levium's houses, there's a different rule, and that is that they're always allowed to redeem their houses. And as opposed to in a walled city where it's just 1 year, the cities of the Levium, they're allowed to redeem it at any time. And it would also go back in the Yovel year. Now in verse 35, some of the laws of poverty. If your brother becomes impoverished and his means falter in your proximity, you shall strengthen him. That's the mitzvah of tzedakah, of giving charity, that if somebody is in a situation of need, so we have a mitzvah to assist them. Proselyte a resident so they can live with you. Do not take from him interest and increase, and you shall fear your God, and let your brother live with you. Do not give him your money for interest, and do not give him your food for increase. I am Hashem your God who took you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be a God unto you. So this is the mitzvah of a prohibition against charging interest to another Jew. And there's a number of laws they derive from this. One of this is, and let your brother live with you. That line, I say, is derived that if someone did charge interest, they have an obligation to return it, and they're not allowed to keep it. And is that? Oh yeah, and another thing the Ramban says, it says, do not give him your money for interest and do not give your food for increase. What are those two things of interest or increase? And that's also in verse 36. Do not take from an interest and increase. This is Hebrew's ribis, neshach v'sarbis. Neshach is interest and sarbis is increase. So the Ramban says that they're referring to two different kinds of interest. One is I think the standard these days is a periodical increase, a period. So let's say someone lends money for a year, and the borrower has to pay 5% every month. So that would be the first case of interest. The Hebrew is neshech, which literally means biting, and that's called neshech. That's called biting, because it's like it's something that doesn't feel like a lot, but it builds up very quickly. It's like biting off, keep on biting off and biting off and biting off. Like credit card debt, that people could just fall into the trap, right. And that 18% interest, whatever it is, just like very quickly balloons up. And sarvis, the increase, is the other case where it's very straightforward, that you say, here's $100 and you'll pay me back $120. And even though that you would think is a little better because it's because the person knows what they're getting into and it's very clear cut. What they're going to pay, that's also prohibited by the Torah. And okay, so what do we do? So how do you get financing as if this interest is prohibited?
Charge a Gentile.
So right, you could lend money to non-Jew, but what does a Jew do? And let's say in Israel, you need to get financed. You're running a business. You need some financing. So what do you do? So the usual way it's done is called, there's a loophole really in the laws of interest, and that is that it's prohibited to lend money with interest. One is allowed though to invest money and get a portion of the profits. which is a classic investment where let's say someone is running a business and they need some financing. So they go to an investor and say, here, could you please give me such and such money, and you get a 5% stake in the business. But usually when people are lending money, they don't want that. They want the security of definitely getting, in that case, if the business tanks, the person will get nothing.
Right.
Someone who's lending money usually wants the security of definitely having it back. So there's a number of different ways of doing it. One of them,
royalties on every unit sold.
Yeah. Well, that might be iffy. There's anytime, just to be clear, anytime that there's an investment with a guaranteed return, pretty much that's a loan. Meaning the Gemara talks about that what you call it doesn't really matter. What matters is what it actually is. And the expression the Gemara uses is that it's close to profit and distant from loss. That if something has an almost guaranteed return and almost impossible to have a loss, that's a loan, no matter what you call it. So like if someone invests money where the investee takes full responsibility for all the money that they invested, and it's impossible to lose, basically, they're guaranteeing the money back, and if the business fails, they'll pay it out of pocket, that's a loan. So the simpler way is a half a loan, half an investment. And that's really the simple way of doing things. The old way, where you're guaranteeing at least to get half the money back, you're lending half the money as a loan, and the other half of the money is an investment, so you might have a smaller stake in the business. The other way, this is the way that it's classically done. There's a term called heter iska, which means a business permit. Meaning it's a permissible way of doing through a business. And that is the following, that when it comes to the principle of a loan, you can guarantee require a very high burden of proof that there was really a loss. And to that point, you could have in the contract that you'll only accept, meaning that with a business, usually you have whoever's running the business just doing the counting, and the proof as to any loss or gain really depends that he puts this down as expense, this down as an expense. He has the receipts, but you don't really know everything. Like you could do an audit, but still it's very hard to prove any line exactly what's accurate. So you could require a very high burden of proof that the principal was actually lost. And to the point that you could put in the contract that you only trust specific people who may not have any way of knowing. Like you may trust Rabbi Slatus and Rabbi Gold to testify. They're the only ones you trust to testify that there was really a loss. That's what the principle. With the profits, though, you can't really do that, because the principle, the guy had it at some point because you gave it to him. So you could require a very high burden of proof that it's actually gone. With the profit, since he didn't start with it, you can't really require that burden of proof. But what you could do, and this is what's usually done in the heter iska, is you could write the contract in such a way, and that is that like we said, that how do you know what the profits were? It's even harder to guarantee the profits than the principal, because the principal you had and you could see what happened to it. But the profits, how could you know exactly how much the person spent and exactly how much the person got back in return? It's something that's very unclear, and it depends on the accounting, like we said. So you could require so an investor could require the investee to swear an oath on Hashem's name on that their accounting is exactly accurate. And almost no observant Jew will do that, because an oath is such a serious, is such a significant thing to do that they won't do. So an observant Jew will not swear an oath, even if they know 100% it's true. Forget about a case like this where you think that you got everything right, but maybe you missed something. And to swear an oath is something that's completely unthinkable on something like this, so they won't swear an oath. So you put a clause in the contract that if you get a certain percentage, so I won't require an oath. Meaning, like, I'm going to forgive the oath if I get a certain percentage, but if I have less than that, so then I'll require an oath as to that what exactly the profits were. And this way you really get around that. Practically you're guaranteed a certain amount, but that's only practically. But technically the person could swear an oath that it was all lost and you could lose everything. So that's the way that's the way it is done in most cases, that you could get financing in that way. And this is very common. People do this all the time. They write up such documents all the time. Okay, so now moving on in verse 39, if your brother is impoverished and is sold to you, and this is what Ellen's been waiting for, you can't work him too hard, and he goes free in the Jubilee year. And usually they're sold for a 6-year period, but if the Jubilee year occurs before the 6 years, he's free. Okay, and there's laws about how much you could subjugate him. And then there's the laws of we could purchase one of our fellow Jews in that way, but we could also purchase in verse 44 on page 705, we could purchase a non-Jew. And in page 47, if in the means of a sojourner who resides with you, that's a non-Jew who lives amongst us, shall become sufficient, and your brother becomes impoverished with him, and he is sold to an alien who resides with you, or to an idol of a sojourner's family. If, let's say, a Jew becomes impoverished and he's sold to a non-Jew, unfortunately, he's sold as a slave to a non-Jew. So, and this is when we're in charge. So, after he's been sold, he shall have redemption. One of his brothers shall redeem him, or so a relative. And so the non-Jew is obligated to sell him back if a relative or his fellow Jew can redeem him. Okay, and on page 707, once again, if he has not been redeemed by these means, then he should go out in Jubilee year, he and his children with him, so he could be freed. For the children of Israel, servants to me, and they're my servants whom I have taken out of the land of Egypt. I am Hashem your God. And then the Parsha concludes on page 707, chapter 26. You shall not make idols for yourself. You shall not erect for yourself a statue or a pillar in your land. You shall not place a flooring stone upon which to prostrate yourself. This is the way of the Gentiles. I am Hashem your God. And my Shabbos shall you observe, and my sanctuary shall you revere. I am Hashem. And I say to say that this is to a warning to a Jew who sold it. We mentioned a Jew who sold in slavery to a non-Jew, that they cannot say that if I've been sold into slavery, I've been abandoned by Hashem, so I can abandon the mitzvahs as well. That's how the Savannah understands it, that Hashem has abandoned me, that I've been sold into servitude, so I can abandon the mitzvahs as well. That's not the case for I am Hashem your God, that Hashem is always with us. And just very quickly, the Haftorah, it's pretty short. It's usually combined with the Chukosai.
Yeah,
very often, but this year, since we have an additional month. We have a 13-month year. Yeah.
That gives you one more week.
Oh yeah, practice chukas. Is it still chukas even this year? You might want to check into that.
Wait, what?
Is it still chukas?
I think
You might want to double check. Okay.
I looked at my mom's yard site.
Okay. So page 1177, part I just wanted to comment on the Haftarah. The Haftarah is from the prophet Jeremiah, and it's one of the foundational Haftarahs because a lot of the laws of kinyanim, of acquisition, come from this, and that is that they were on the verge of exile from the land of Israel, and in spite of that, Yirmiyah says, where am I on page 1178, he instructed them in the bill of sale, and in verse 13, I instructed Baruch before their eyes, saying, so said Hashem, master of legions, God of Israel. Verse 13 on page 1178. Take these documents, this bill of sale, the sealed one and unsealed document, and place them in an earthenware vessels that will last for many days. For so said Hashem, master of legions, God of Israel, houses, fields, and vineyards will yet be bought in this land. He was telling them that save your bills of sale, save your deeds, because even though we're about to be exiled from the land, we'll be back and you'll need it. And it was a great comfort to the people. And we also learned from there that you could actually, one of the ways of affecting a sale is transfer of property is through a bill of sale, through a contract. Okay, shkaya.